So we now have a talk by Andy Cater about the community team. Andy.
So, for people that can't see me, you have a middle-aged man sitting down in a wheelchair facing a screen. Right. So, community team. This is not a definition of Debian as a community. That would be far too big, far too hard. This is a quick explanation of who we are as a community team and the sort of things we do. And there'll be space at the end to argue, disagree, throw questions at us. So, next slide, please. So, who are we? We have Luke Faraone, we have Sruti Chandran, we have Jean-Philippe Manguel, me, Andy Cater, and Steve, who's ably doing the slides. There's a DPL delegation to form the team, so yes, we have a formal status. So there we go. What are we trying to do? Debian is huge and vast, and there are lots of people following what we do. So, we're trying to make Debian a welcoming place, particularly for new contributors or people who are not familiar with us. We try to stop extreme bad behavior on IRC or mailing lists. The way we do that is quite often by giving people quiet advice on how to present themselves better or how to come across better. We try to stop arguments and flame wars. Essentially, we're taking a dispassionate view to try and make things better for everyone. So, where are we? Our mail address is community@debian.org, which will get to us. We hang around watching various mailing lists. We also watch various channels on IRC. But we're not deliberately looking out for things, to some extent. I try to move wrong list posters away from Debian Project or Debian Devel and other lists. These are usually people who've seen community and go to us, or go to, Debian Project, we'll just spam the whole project. I try to impose some order on the Debian user mailing list so that it remains at least slightly useful. This is where you discover that for every 20 posters, there are 1,000 people lurking in the background. Next, please. So, we have volunteers in different time zones. We're not the Debian enforcers. We have no special powers. We are Debian developers. It helps to know a little bit about how Debian works. People can refer something to us if they've seen us. They can ask us for an opinion. They can ask us to mediate, but we're not trained mediators. We will chat back to the IRC admins and sometimes the mailing list folk. Very occasionally, of the order of a couple of times a year potentially, we'll ask for one user's access to lists or IRC to be suspended. Quite often these are people new to Debian or trolls who just get out of hand. Next one, please. So, that was really quick. I didn't expect it to be that quick. But, questions, discussion, and we will possibly moderate this discussion.
Yeah, hello. Thank you for the work. So there are unofficial channels being created, for example, Telegram. And I'm not sure if you have a take on that, because there is some behavior there that sometimes is not good, and we're not entitled to react to that because it's not official channel. So I don't know, what's your opinion or your thought, if you had a thought about that?
I think this is quite difficult because we can't be everywhere at once, and because we can't impose Debian norms and Debian codes of conduct on third parties quite so readily. We ask nicely that people keep to the Debian codes of conduct. We ask nicely that people follow mailing list guidelines. We can't really stamp on people except with the ultimate sanction of removing them from a list or banning them from IRC. So unofficial channels potentially are a problem. If they remain unofficial, then potentially we can say, sorry, this is not official Debian policy. That's probably about as far as we can go.
We would like any recognised place where Debian discussions are happening to basically follow reasonable guidelines, the Debian Code of Conduct. If somebody comes up with something that people think is Debian, like you mentioned, say an unofficial Telegram channel or whatever, and people are not behaving sensibly, we do have the option of using trademark and whatever to try and shut things down. But obviously, we need to be aware of these places. We don't have, as Andy says, we don't have the time or the bandwidth to watch everything. We do want to make Debian, and that's not just the Debian development process, but all of Debian and all of the Debian associated places to be welcoming and to be sensible places. We do our best.
Right. So as a second question, maybe it's not for you, but do you think, we have IRC and mailing list as main communication official channels, but should we broaden the scope and maybe have some official channels elsewhere more up to the time, like have an official channel in Telegram or other new issues?
It comes down to, I guess, finding the people to run those things and finding the admins who we can work with, yeah.
Admins is actually an important thing because we need access. So we need to be able to talk to the admins or whatever. And that's where it becomes difficult. I think also Debian reputation is much wider than you think, because it comes into things like, posts on lwn.net or posts on Slashdot or whatever. We can only be concerned with Debian main channels, I think. Otherwise, there is just too much.
It's part of what we're doing as part of the Debian social team and running a matrix instance. It's integrated into our IRC channels where possible and where people have requested it. And we follow much of a similar moderation process following Debian guidelines and things like that. So it's an experiment and potentially somewhere where we can expand and tie into other things.
The community team will join in if people ask for help. Say, for example, the Debian forums. There was a real problem a couple of years ago where the moderators and admins, the Debian people around had moved on, and there was a problem with bad behaviour starting to dominate. And so we helped a few people to recover the setup and basically return it back to a sensible, reasonable place for Debian users and developers to communicate. We can absolutely do that with other channels, with other fora as needed.
Okay, thank you.
I think it comes down to contact us as the community team and say, this is happening, and then we will see if we can get access to whatever. If we don't know, we can't intervene. Okay.
I'm not seeing anybody else asking questions, so I'll say it. What you're doing is very much a thankless job. So on behalf of the rest of the project, I would very much like to thank you all for this, because I realise that by the time you guys get involved, if by the time somebody has drawn your attention to it, things have already probably got out of hand, and it's going to be sapping, draining, demoralising work. And thank you for all of your time and effort. It is appreciated. So on behalf of the rest of the project, thank you.
One thing I will say is, it's the job of everybody to try and make Debian a welcoming place. We're the backstop. We will do our best. But obviously, if you see people behaving badly and abusing others, or not behaving as you would like to see, it is also your place to have that quiet conversation and say to them, ideally in private, you don't necessarily need to call people out in public, but at least it is everybody's job to make the community a better place.
And as a rider to that, if anybody knows how to break great long mailing list threads that last for days and weeks, please tell me.
So I have a slightly difficult question. I'm not. How do you see the communication culture, let me put it like that, in Debian? Do you think that? How far do you think Debian has to go before it becomes a truly welcoming place for everyone?
That's a really difficult question. And that goes into Debian as a much bigger organization than individuals, developers, goes out to Debian users, goes out broadly to the Debian culture. And hey, we've got PhD researchers who have looked into that in the past, trying to systematize Debian into something they can understand. I think there is something very much about Debian being English-speaking. I think there is something about Debian potentially being localized. I think as a whole thing, we need to become better aware. But from my perspective on the community team, I cannot change the world. I can change mailing lists occasionally, day by day.
So I would say generally things are better than they were. We don't tend to have the incredible flame wars that we had when I first got into Debian back in the 90s, but there is always space to improve. Even if you're not using the official bad words that everybody recognises, intent can be read. If you're not welcoming of new ideas, if you shut conversations down, if you mistreat people, even if it's not particularly obvious, then you're not helping. Again, we should be trying to encourage people to do all of those things, to be nice to each other. But we don't expect everybody to be perfect, but there are places where we can, even if we make mistakes, even if we're not welcoming and friendly, at least try, apologise afterwards. If we rethink how we interact with each other, we can make things better.
And it's okay to make mistakes. It's not okay to keep making mistakes and to keep making the place really difficult for other people. That's a wide thing. I think there is something about being accepting, because it is a very wide community, and the more you look into it, the wider it gets.
Yeah. And tying that back to, we have had feedback in the past that some people think we're thought police and other such daft ideas. We're definitely not. And again, we acknowledge we're human, we make mistakes, and we lash out sometimes. We don't necessarily want to shut down how people think. What we do want to do is stop people hurting each other and that does happen all the time. We do our best, and I think that Debian as a whole, that means all of us, can and should do better. I appreciate that sounds wishy-washy, but that's how it is. People are wishy-washy. Do we have a?
I'd like to give an example from the company that I work for. They try to express their values as challenge, collaborate, and care. And for a while, I took those as 3 different values until at one moment my boss said it's challenge with care. It's very often, the problem is when you're talking about technical things, to get in the heat of the discussion, you're challenging, but there's the part where you're also talking with humans and they're the receiving end. And it's always a very difficult balance to challenge as far as you need to go without that becoming a problem.
I think it's difficult because some of our communication channels are equivalent to playing postal chess. And it's sometimes quite difficult to remember that there is an individual at the other end. And flame wars go that way, I think.
But even in a room, you can have exactly the same thing, even
Absolutely.
without that difficult communication channel.
I mean, some people describe it as, you might want to talk about the technical thing, work on that rather than working on the person on the other side. It's, don't criticise the people, criticise ideas, and be careful of how you describe those things. Who's up next? Jonathan.
You've talked a little bit about what the community team is and also importantly what it isn't. On a practical level, how can Joe, random member of the community who contacts you, expect things like timescales and confidentiality and so on?
Confidentiality is relatively straightforward in that mails to community get shared only to community team initially for informal discussion and a consensus, and we will then decide. We will very rarely share details. We will share potentially that there's an issue. If somebody needs to be removed from the project, that's a bigger, different thing. But we will talk to, for example, the IRC admins and say, we have noticed this course of actions on IRC. Do you agree with us? Can we possibly block XYZ from IRC channels that we control?
We try, if people contact us, to get back to them in a reasonably short period of time. We at least want to acknowledge contact within 1 or 2 days. Obviously, as volunteers, we can't guarantee this, but we do our best on that front, and we try to give a further consideration and get back to people properly shortly afterwards. But as Andy says, we do keep confidentiality. It's critical. We don't want to be, sharing bad things, or potentially putting people at risk if they have made a perfectly valid complaint about bad behaviour. The last thing we want to do is make things worse for them. We totally understand how important that is. Nicola.
Yes. Do you think that the Debian community as a whole is doing enough to avoid you having to do too many things? Is there enough self-enforcement by the community? What could the community do better to help you?
I think there's something about, going back to Paul's thing about the 3 words being caring, I think there's something about stopping to think and being constructive. And if the community can be constructive, that's enormously helpful. That might require you to take your finger off the keyboard for a minute before you send that email. But I think as a community, or certainly that segment that I see, we are getting better. There will always be room for improvement. There will always be isolated people who you think, gosh, I wish they would improve. But as a whole, as a community, we are getting gradually better. It's an incremental process.
There is always space for people to do more. And we have had people talk to us to volunteer to say, I'm trying to dive in on mailing lists or IRC and whatever, and respond, and we like the help. It's great if we don't have to get involved, and if the informal pushback or positive feedback to people to say, or constructive feedback, I should say, to say, I don't think that was necessarily how you wanted to word that message. Have you thought about how other people are taking your communications? That's wonderful, and we'd love to see it more. Ideally before it comes to us. Some people instinctively are scared that if we contact them, that there could be a banhammer or something following up. We don't want to go to those places either, but the very fact we are delegated immediately makes some people worried that we might be about to impose sanctions of some kind. It's awesome if we don't have to. It's awesome if it never gets to us. It's awesome if we don't have to do any kind of follow-up. But it happens. People make mistakes.
Very often, a small reminder or saying that you're not getting your point across because of the way that came across. It might be easier if you could do is enough to set people thinking, oh yeah, okay, I can do that for the future.
And in extreme cases, if people are really, really struggling to get their points across without being confrontational, without upsetting people, I mean, we are prepared if people ask for help. We would rather people come to us for help and ask, can you review what I'm saying here? Can you give me advice? Oh, hell yes, we would rather do that than potentially have to clean up afterwards if they didn't. Again, time and effort available. Talking of which, the community team is always short of effort. And I'm sure, this is a volunteer project. We all know how Debian is short of effort in just about anything that we're trying to do. We're always looking for more people to dive in and help, especially if from people who are good at communication, who are good at just providing advice. It doesn't have to be formal, again, but to be in the community team for exactly the reasons that we mentioned earlier about confidentiality and stuff, we do ask that official community team members are full Debian project members. So this is not something that outsiders can really be trusted with. There are going to be private things, and we know how that works. But we would be over the moon if any people here or watching online might want to join the team and help us. It can be demoralising. It can be deeply draining. I will be brutally honest. But knowing that you have friends around who you can share the task with is also a really, really uplifting thing.
I think there's also various folk, and I won't embarrass them by naming them, who are good examples just in and of themselves. And I sometimes look at things going on mailing lists and say, damn, I wish I'd written that.
We all know how awesome Russ is. I will embarrass him. But you don't have to be that good. Just being willing and able to help and be positive, be constructive, it's a great idea for all of us. It's a great aim. We don't all manage it all the time. You know, and occasionally, you know, Andy and I lash out at each other.
Yep.
We try not to fall out. Yes, Peter.
You mentioned long threads on mailing lists. I feel one of the difficulties in Debian, and this is possibly not something you as the community team can directly address, is that there really seems to be no middle ground between expressing your opinion on a mailing list at one extreme and a general resolution at the other. There's no, other than kind of contributing to this mega thread, there's no way to kind of put your 2 cents into the overall opinion of, into what people perceive as the overall opinion of the project.
So what would you suggest?
I don't know.
Again, we try to help. We don't claim to be experts on these things. I mean, but one of the actually, to pick the long mailing list thread, one of the things that we wish some people would do better is not contribute to a thread if they're not actually contributing something useful. I'm looking at you because I'm talking to you. This is not me saying that you do this, don't worry, Peter. There are some people who do, however, swamp threads because they feel they have to respond to every other message. And that can be a really difficult, it can be a really draining issue because, of course, for the people who don't have the time or don't have the inclination or, you know, they've got other things to do, they end up feeling that, well, but just by the weight of, you know, by the number of words being said over there, that's the way the project is going. It would be nice if some people could acknowledge and say, I've said my piece, some people have responded, I don't have to have the last word, that kind of thing.
In real life, there is the tendency amongst too many of us, and I include myself, to say, something must be done, this is something, therefore I must contribute, this must be done. Try and resist it slightly on the mailing lists.
Yeah. We have a really quite loud culture sometimes where people do feel they have to have say things on the lists or in IRC and continue, when actually most of the things in Debian are happening quietly in the background. And you may find that the person you were talking to who's stopped talking, they might agree with you, they might not, or they're just busy because they have a day job. You know, it's a difficult thing to judge, especially with online communications, and I wish I had there isn't a perfect answer. Helmut.
I happen to have contributed to very long email threads over and over again, adding lots of content. Then I had someone give me advice on improving, which is very similar to what was said already, and I kind of condensed it into, if there is something I can technically add, a new wrinkle or something, then I can do that. If I can answer a question, if I have a question of my own asking for, how did you mean that, then I can add. And if there's an opinion, I should maybe just not answer. And in trying to practice that, I think I've managed to reduce quite a bit of volume for the better. And I suggest that maybe you can try this for your own. My experience with this model is quite good.
One last thing I will add. It is quite helpful. 2 last things. Amongst our last things. Changing subjects to make them more relevant and saying, this part of the thread, it was whatever it was before. So if you should not, ideally, keep adding things into a thread. If you do change subject to comment on what somebody has said earlier in the thread, please make it clear in the subject. It helps a lot. The other thing is, periodically, if somebody can take a step back and produce a summary of the discussion, dispassionately, again, at one step removed, if you can summarize these 15 things that we've been talking about in this long thread come down to 5 things, and these are the 5 things. That helps enormously for busy readers and people who don't have time. And that's fairly simple to do.
Yeah. You beat me to it. I was going to say the summary thing is huge. Remember that, especially with volunteers, in general in the project, and the volunteer you're talking to, and who of course you've been writing a lot of mail about the details of user merge or tag to upload or changes to which Debian CD images we're producing or whatever, but don't necessarily expect that everybody else is following. Don't expect that everybody else will follow all the nuances, and summarising in a way that other people can pick up is a really, really awesome thing to do. Do we have any more questions?
There is one question from IRC. I'm sorry if you're watching, I don't recognise the nickname, and I think it's addressed at the room in general, not necessarily Steve and Andy. I would be interested to know how attendees perceive the job of the community team, whether it's useful, whether it's efficient or not, and what kind of improvements might be welcome in those areas.
It's worth for the room. Is it useful? Yes. Do we want it? No. It would be lovely if we didn't need the community team at all, because we're all behaving properly all the time. But as already said, we never do. If we can all improve, then the community team has less work to do. But ultimately, there needs to be a course of action to escalate if you have to. It's nice to have somewhere to step in, or somebody to step in before it gets to that point. So is it being efficient? Is it doing everything we want it to do? I guess if you're on the receiving end of something, it's never efficient enough. It's always too slow and too late. And that's where, as Steve and Andrew were saying earlier, it's really good if we can step up and just say, is that the right thing? And nip something in the bud before it becomes too much of an issue.
Even if the community team write to you and express disagreement, it's not personal. It isn't directed at the person and their conduct generally. It's directed at the way in which things come across. It's not a direct personal attack on any individual or any group. We try to stand at one remove, be dispassionate, and try and distance ourselves from the message we're getting across, because that's being constructive and that's being clear.
And of course, why we're doing this is we care about the project. We care about the people in the project, which is, we volunteer to help. There were plenty of other things I'd like to do as well, but as time has gone on, I've realised that there are more projects than I'll ever have time for, so it's a priorities thing. So if anybody would like to volunteer, you know where to find us. We will happily talk you through the job that we do in more detail. We're not going to bore everybody with it right now. Do we have any more questions, or are we about done?
There was a question expressed to me or to the community team in general, which was, should we be professional mediators, professionally trained in counselling or how to respond? And I think, although that might be desirable, I don't think it's practicable, and we are a distributed team. So to some extent it comes down to who is available at the time. And we all have different levels of experience, empathy, understanding. I don't think we're professionals at this, but I don't think we ought to be in that sense. I think that would be going perhaps a step too far, but that's a personal opinion.
Hello.
So I know it happens every once in a while that somebody in the community is getting riled up about something and loses a bit touch about connection with the rest of the community, and then it's like, well, somebody should have a word with them in private and listen to what's going bad about their life at the moment, why they care so much, and make sure their opinion is that they can voice their opinion, but take it down a notch or three, because this is, and it's a high expectation to have on a small team. But at the same time, it's a bit sad if somebody should have a word crashes against, sorry, we're busy. So I wonder if there could be a lot more people on call, and the community team could distribute the somebody should have a word to a much larger amount of people who may somehow be able to do it.
Well, somebody should have a word is potentially the entire audience of mailing list.
Right.
But considerately and, constructively. And that word might not need to be much. It might just need to be, there may be a better way of doing this. But
to be honest, in some cases, I think, particularly as Enrico was suggesting, I'm prepared to be the person listening if you just need to be listened to sometimes. If we can have more volunteers happy to pick that up, yes, that would be awesome. Please talk to us if you'd like to help in that kind of setup.
Because expecting the community to be able to have a word sometimes means that if somebody loses it, they have like 10 new problems in the inbox who are trying to have a word, and that tends also not to improve once they.
Sure.
So.
No, understood.
Yeah. Ian.
Yeah, I mean, that is an excellent idea. There's a number of reasons why it's better if that comes from the community team, partly because you don't want to end up with a dogpile situation. And also, I think if you get, supposing you've overstepped a mark and somebody needs to have a word with you, it comes across a bit differently if you receive a mail that says, the community team has asked me to look into this discussion you've been having, and I would like to give you this advice. That has an additional weight to it, which I think will be helpful. I also really like the idea of you having a panel of volunteers. That will make it much easier to select somebody who isn't already, on a side in some whatever drama is happening. You can probably find somebody who's a neutral third party who maybe one side or the other will respect. So please, would you set up internally such a list of people, and I will volunteer to be on it for what it's worth. You probably won't want to send me to many disputes, but I'll be on your list.
I think there is something about, everybody having 5 or 6 people that know them well, that they trust. And I think there is something about, if you as an individual see somebody who you know well, not necessarily overstepping the line or looking, being stressed online or whatever, there is always are you okay? We are here for you. And in some sense, that's Debian as not just a mailing list, not just a project with N number of developers and maintainers, but actually Debian as a human organization made up of humans. And that's something that we don't always show very well, but is very much part of who we are. And a room like this, full of people who choose to come together, is really very valuable indeed. But we don't get to do this very often. So there is a sense of looking out for the people you know best and understand best, and just checking in with them sometimes to say, are you okay?
Also, if you are interested in helping out, a great way of helping is the people who you've never met before. You see new people turn up. Maybe, once in a while, talk to someone and ask, who are you? What do you do? How can I help you? For those of us who've been around for 20 odd years, and oh God, I feel old sometimes, and who already have those connections, and you have the 5, 10, 50 people or whatever who can give you advice, can give you support when you need it. It's wonderful for us. For the new people who don't, or the people on the edges of the community who are just joining, or who don't have that experience, who don't have those connections, it could be really, really nice to try and make those connections, build those bridges.
And if it helps, I'm in a room full of unfamiliar people, because I know IRC, Nix. I know you from online. I have no clue what you look like.
This is Andy. He's a nice person, I promise. I think we're about done. Awesome. Thank you all for coming. And definitely, please talk to us, not just about the bad things, but also about the good things, and more volunteers to help, whether that's formally or on the informal, list that Enrico has suggested. All of these ideas sound really good. We don't have all the answers. If you think we do, you don't know us very well. We just want more people to help, and we can all improve. Thank you.